Hi, everybody. I wanted to recap our discussion from a couple days ago or from yesterday about African Americans and women in the Civil War very quickly, and then we are going to move on to the effects of the Civil War. And I wrote my stuff down so that I'm just going to kind of read from the transcript so that I don't ramble on for too long. So get out your homework and get ready, and we'll get started with the Civil War effects and a recap of what we've studied. All right, so if you remember, if you were an African American in the northern part of our country, part of the Union, you could join the Union Army and serve in an all black regiment, kind of like what we see here. But remember that the leaders would have been white men, and don't really have a lot of information about why that was, but that's how it was. These soldiers fought proudly for the freedom of all African Americans in the U.S. Now, if you were an African American in the South, then you might have a role much like you would have normally. You would have been like a personal slave to a white Confederate leader. And these men were sometimes sent into battle, but most of the white men that were fighting for the South didn't want to give the African Americans weapons, so they didn't send a whole lot of men to fight in their place, which is something that we sort of touched on in class. Now, remember the story of Robert Smalls and how he escaped on a Confederate ship, became a naval captain for the Union, and then later became a congressman after the Civil War. Recap real quick on women during the Civil War. Remember, this is a very interesting thing that the women did for the Civil War. They served in the Army as directly, like this woman in the picture. She was actually, her job was to wash the men's uniforms and to try to keep things neat and tidy, and she did some cooking for them also. And then there were also nurses, seamstresses, and women that had to run factories and businesses and plantations while the men were at war. Also, remember that Clara Barton was one of the more famous nurses in the Civil War. She was called the Angel of the Battlefield because of her hard work and service to those who were wounded. She established the American Red Cross, and that she was the only woman to ever receive. No, I'm sorry. She established the American Red Cross. We look at the next woman who we spoke about, Mary Walker. She was the only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor. I started to say that about Clara Barton. Remember that she was the one that was the surgeon, even though it wasn't very popular for women to be surgeons, and she tirelessly helped others during the Civil War. And finally, Frances Clayton, and she was the one who dressed up like a man and joined the Union Army with her husband. She was one of many women who actually did that. Now, I want to quickly move on. Some of these we've talked about a little bit, but I'm going to go into just a little bit more detail about them. This war was really difficult for both sides. It put brother against brother, friends fighting against each other as people chose sides. Some of it had to do with where people lived, and other decisions were based on how that person felt was the right thing to do. As the war went on, the Confederate armies ended up enlisting these young men they're so young. I mean, look at those faces. Those young men that you're looking at here in these pictures are probably about the same age that you are. They were young, they were inexperienced, and they were very poorly equipped. They didn't have the best equipment or the best uniforms. So this is it's very kind of sad almost. And that's one of the effects of the Civil War that we need to take note of. Another one is that we talked about the destruction of the South in class. There's a few more pictures here of some of that destruction. The top left picture, and that's this one right here, is actually a picture of a house. And if you are familiar with the beautiful houses of this time period, they had the big balconies and the roofs that came down, and all that you see left is the front columns there. The rest of it has been torn apart. Then next to that one, this one over here, is actually part of Richmond, where they went through and destroyed Richmond, and this was a factory. And then the bottom house here is a picture of a house that you see there's a huge hole in the wall, like maybe a cannon went through, or cannon fire went through it. Something of that nature happened to this house, and that was very common because, as we've said before, battles happen in people's backyards. And here are two more pictures. These are both from the research that I did, ruins of part of Atlanta after it was burned. General Sherman and his men went from Atlanta to Savannah in this wide path, and they called it slash and burn, and they just destroyed everything in their path. Now, another side effect of the Civil War, and I'm sorry that the screen's a little off of this one. You can see most of the words, though. The battle was difficult and brutal and often hand-to-hand combat. This type of fighting is hard on soldiers' bodies and difficult to sustain. Also, all the men were off fighting, so women had to run those businesses and plantations, which we talked about, with the women's roles. This is interesting because the women didn't usually have the right to do this, as we talked about during the women's suffrage movement. This time period right here, they're still going through that suffrage movement. So a lot of the women had a hard time handing everything back over to the men when they came back from war. And then we also talked in class about the Confederacy and how its money became worthless, and that this was really hard on the Southern economy because if you were a wealthy Confederate, maybe plantation owner, you had all your money in Confederate dollars, suddenly it's not worth anything and you go broke very quickly, and that was very hard on the economy and on the people. And then finally, disease was a major killer. If you were wounded, your chances of surviving the actual wound, the gunshot wound, were usually pretty good, as long as it wasn't in the gut area, your head, or your heart. However, the chances of you getting an infection were really, really high. Many of the men died because of this, just after the battle, because of the disease. This is a picture of a field hospital, which would be a hospital that's out where they're camping and fighting. It's not a building like we have now. An example of being able to survive your gunshot wound but not the disease that you catch is Stonewall Jackson. He survived getting shot in the arm. It was the pneumonia that actually ended up killing him a few days later. And field hospitals like this one in the picture were really, really crowded. They were open out outside. There was, dirt floors, grass, nature all around them. Those that had enough tents to shelter in tents would have had one so full, most likely, of wounded men that disease would spread even faster. They had stale air. There wasn't, an air conditioning system. The cramped quarters. The diseases that they dealt with were things like dysentery, which is inflamed intestines and diarrhea, typhoid, which is an illness caused by bacteria, smallpox, which is a fever and rash that can end up killing you, and then yellow fever, which is transmitted by the mosquitoes that they were dealing with when they fought down in the South. We all know the mosquitoes get bad. And then cholera, which is a bacterial infections of the intestines that causes severe diarrhea. These diseases were spread because people weren't living in sanitary conditions. They didn't have indoor plumbing, they didn't wash their hands, they didn't even bathe very often. Their clothes were dirty. They were right up next to each other all the time in tents and in hospitals, and they also weren't getting proper nutrition. So if they got sick, think about when you're sick, you rest, and maybe somebody makes you some chicken soup or you drink extra juice. These men didn't have that. They were barely getting enough nutrients through eating hardtack and dried salted beef, or pork rather. If they had fruits and vegetables, it was because they picked them up along the way while they were marching. So that had a big play in their sickness as well, not having that proper nutrition. Now, the Civil War is the bloodiest war in American history. We lost more people in this battle than we have on any battle that we fought on American soil or on foreign soil. And it's a dark time in our nation's history. After the war ended, we entered this period of time called Reconstruction, which you will learn a lot about next year. It had its own problems, and the Confederate States, as they were rejoining the Union and they were rebuilding the South, there was lots that they had to overcome. But they did, and here we are living in Virginia, part of the Union, not the Confederacy, and we don't have a lot of the problems that we had back then. We have different ones, but I hope that you've enjoyed this study on the Civil War. I've really enjoyed hearing all your questions and all of your feedback, and I really am glad that we were able to study this together. I learned a lot as well. So hopefully you can get all this information and put it in your brain and keep it there. And I guess I will see you tomorrow in class, and have a good night. Bye.